welcome everyone to the first in a series of webcasts which will highlight ongoing work and recent research around social and emotional learning and peace building. This webcast is produced by the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network. This is a program of the U.S. Agency for International Development. My name is Colette Chabbott. I'm the Senior Researcher for ECCN, and I will be your host today. In November 2016, MercyCorps released a study called Critical Choices. This study assesses the effects of education and civic engagement on the propensity toward violence for Somali youth. 3 staff who have been intimately involved in this study are here to discuss the main findings and implications. They will now be introduced by Scriven, who is MercyCorps' Senior Director of Strategic Programs. Karen?
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry for just a little challenge here. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Scriven. I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Programs for MercyCorps. I oversee our Youth, Gender, and Girls portfolio, and I'm also the co-chair of the ECCN steering group. I'm really excited to have 2 colleagues with me today. Feysal Osman, who is our Civic Engagement Specialist. He oversees all of the youth engagement work within our Somalia program. And Beza Tesfaye, who's the Research Manager for Conflict and Governance here at MercyCorps. So really great to have them here today. They're the ones who spearheaded this important research. So let me hand it over to Feysal.
Actually, I'm going to do just a few more details before we get started.
Sorry.
That's fine. I want to remind everyone, Karen and Feysal and Beza will present for about 40 minutes. You were muted as you entered this virtual room to cut down on background noise, but we do want you to participate. First of all, if you have any troubles, if you cannot hear the speakers or you have trouble with the transmission, please send us a message via the chat function of WebEx. You can find this function by going to the right side of the WebEx page and clicking on chat. This will open a chat box where you can type a message. Finally, use the drop-down menu above the box to select the host as the recipient for your message. As we go along, however, even more importantly, I hope that you will submit comments and questions in the chat box. Speakers will respond to all comments and questions at the end of the main presentation. Again, please use the drop-down menu above the box to select everyone as the recipient for your message so everyone can understand what you're asking. And now, finally, with no further ado, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Feysal, to Beza, and to Karen.
Yes, thank you, Colette. Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody, depending on where you are on the planet. Sorry if you are not in the U.S. or the Horn of Africa. Let me just start off our webcast today with the bigger policy-relevant question: can development programs reduce violence? If so, then what interventions work to reduce the risk of youth engaging in political violence? Understanding what works to reduce violence, including violent extremism, has been a key priority for many policymakers for a long time. However, there has been very limited research evaluating the effects of development programs on the reduction of violence. In order to address this knowledge gap, MercyCorps conducted a rigorous evaluation to test the impact of increasing access to formal education and civic engagement opportunities on youth support and participation in political violence. The study focused on one of MercyCorps' flagship complex programs in Somalia, the Somali Youth Learners Initiative, SYLI. SYLI is a 5-year USAID-funded program that targets youth between the ages of 15 to 24, and it's implemented across Somalia, including Somaliland, Puntland, and the south central part of Somalia. The overall target of SYLI is over 100,000 youth, Somali youth across the country, eventually by the end of the program. SYLI's overarching goal is to contribute to Somalia's stability and reduce the appeal of violent extremism. The program has 3 intermediate results. Result number 1 is providing education, formal education to secondary education. Result number 2 is providing non-formal education to out-of-school youth. Goal number 3 is providing civic engagement opportunities. But before I dive into the specific activities under each goal, let me just give you a quick overview of the context in which SYLI started. SYLI started working in the northern part of Somalia, Somaliland, and then expanded to Puntland, and then gradually to the south and central part of the country. There are multiple layers in Somalia. As you know, Somaliland is a separate entity. Puntland is part of the federal government, but there has been relative peace in both Somaliland and Puntland, and that's where SYLI started its implementation at the beginning. So in order for SYLI to do any sort of activity, you can imagine you have to deal with all sorts of administrations from Somaliland, Puntland, and South Central Somalia, and the federal government, working with them closely and building consensus with the community leaders to establish schools to provide opportunities for youth. The situation in which SYLI started, young people are account for 75% in the country's total population. 75% of the country's total population is youth, and there are very limited opportunities available for those youth. Only 2 to 6% have access to secondary education. Female enrollment in secondary schools has been largely very slow, 10 to 20%. Unemployment stands at 67%, and most youth are very vulnerable to all sorts of negative engagement, piracy, be it piracy, clan conflicts, violence, and other criminal networks and criminal activities. So you can imagine the context in which SYLI started was very grim picture. And the federal government and the Somaliland government and Puntland, all regional governments, they rely on international support to address the critical challenges facing Somali youth. So SYLI's response was based on a very holistic approach, providing key components: non-formal education, formal education, non-formal education, and civic engagement. And SYLI started reviving the public education sector by working closely with the Ministry of Education. So goal number 2, SYLI started working to provide goal number one is to provide access to secondary education for those who cannot afford to go to school. SYLI constructed and rehabilitated schools under this result. The schools that were constructed in Somaliland are 22. We have constructed in Puntland 17 schools and 21 schools in South Central Somalia. That brings us to a total of 60 schools across the country. That's a huge investment and creating opportunities, educational opportunities for youth who could not afford to go to private schools. Following the collapse of the central government in Somalia, the public education sector has essentially collapsed. Private institutions step in to provide limited opportunities. However, those opportunities were only afforded by the well-off. most of the youth that I talked about, the 75% of the population, could not afford to go to school. SYLI was designed to create opportunity for most of these youth. So in addition to constructing schools across the country, SYLI also worked closely with Ministry of Education to provide a quality education, improve the quality of education by providing school furniture, teaching and learning materials to schools constructed under the program, and also training teachers. SYLI trained over 2,000 teachers, both pre-service and in-service, giving them courses. The pre-service is exclusively for female teachers only. To promote girls' education in a male-dominated education system in Somalia, SYLI created opportunities for young girls by creating the Girls Empowerment Forums in each school, in each and every school that SYLI supported. Sponsored female teachers, more than 200 female teachers were sponsored for 2-year course by SYLI. SYLI also worked and trained with school education committees, the CECs, ministry officials, both at the regional and at the federal levels. SYLI also trained the school community alongside the community education committees and the officials to come up with what's called the school improvement plans. The school improvement plan ensures that the community take ownership and they work on the sustainability of the school activities that SYLI started. So under Goal 1, that's the holistic approach SYLI was trying to provide a constructing schools, providing all the materials that a school requires, constructing girl-friendly spaces and latrines for girls and boys, training teachers, and providing a teacher training course, 2-year teacher training course for female teachers, and then promoting and strengthening the system for the government. Under Goal 2 of SYLI is providing non-formal education to out-of-school youth. SYLI, for those who got the opportunity to go to formal school, they're fine. They're going to formal schools. But what about those who never had the opportunity or who dropped out from school and never had the opportunity to go to school? SYLI created a non-formal education component under Result 2. The non-formal education component also had an economic skills and opportunities section that was discontinued and was not part of this research. Goal number 2 was not part of this research. Goal number 3 was the civic engagement component, and the goal was to reduce isolation and give platform to utilize their skills. SYLI provided civic engagement opportunities for both in-school and out-of-school youth. SYLI identifies youth leaders who serve as peer mobilizers and trains them in conflict analysis, peace building, team building, and leadership skills. They develop small-scale projects after their training on issues affecting them or their community, and they start mobilizing their peers and implement those small-scale projects. For example, one of the very popular projects that the in-school youth carry out on weekly basis now, or in some cases, or monthly basis, is the environmental cleanup campaign, where they mobilize their community or their peers in the school and conduct a cleanup campaign, one-day cleanup campaign. So it's all youth-led, student-led, based on the training the rigorous training that they go through, and we give them the platform to exercise and implement their skills, to utilize their skills. We have noticed significant changes in schools and communities where we implemented the civic engagement activities. Youth are organizing themselves now in the schools where we implemented civic engagement program. They undertake projects addressing common issues, issues facing youth themselves, or common issues that are facing their community. And they do this through a peer mobilization network and by working closely with the community leaders, with the school, with the CCs, with the school education committees, and the school management. SYLI builds also under this result the capacity of Ministry of Youth and local youth organizations and local youth umbrellas for out-of-school youth. Currently, MercyCorps is working to institutionalize some of these activities by helping the government to develop a comprehensive youth policy that will create an enabling environment for these types of activities, for the youth to carry out these types of activities. So SYLI is based on these three major goals, and under each goal there are a specific set of activities that the youth carry out. If we can go to the next slide. So if you can see these pictures, the youth, mainly young girls and boys, discussing or coming up with an action plan to develop an action plan that they can carry out within their school. And it's part of the civic engagement component. After the training, the youth have to come together and come up with a small-scale project that they undertake within the school. Keep going. These are some pictures showing you out-of-school youth discussing. So basically what the civic engagement component does is it provides a platform where young leaders come together with their leaders. We provide the platform. They ask questions affecting them. They come up with a comprehensive strategy to address youth at risk, youth who are very vulnerable to be affected, to be isolated, or maybe coming from marginalized communities. And they come up with activities that they think they can engage. And this is, we use this through the peer-to-peer pressure network that the youth, the student club leaderships use under the civic engagement component. And it has proven to be very effective in communities where SYLI implemented the civic engagement components. So you can see the out-of-school youth activities across the country and now, this research focused only Somaliland. We have focused Somaliland because Somaliland, we have implemented the program, it's the place where we have implemented the program the longest, over 5 years now. And we thought that the program has matured in those areas, and we could do some sort of studying the impact of education and civic engagement and whether they contribute to the reduction of political violence in the northern part. Continue with the next slide. So these are the out-of-school youth activities. The civic engagement activities also include sports events that promote peace building, integration among youth and their communities. For example, youth from warring clans interacting together, working as a team, playing football, soccer, and then working as a team. And through these sports events, they carry out advocacy campaigns. They try to mobilize the community, issues affecting them, specific themes that they come up with, and widely publicized through local and international media. So the motivation for this research, first of all, why did we do this research and why did we study this particular program is because there has been most of the research, there's been a growing body of research that focused on the drivers of conflict, the drivers of violence, but there's been little evidence on what works to reduce or to address those drivers. So since this has been a very effective program in those areas in Somaliland, MercyCorps wanted to understand the impact of this program, this long-term investment. The other motivation was the Somali federal government developed a national strategy to prevent and counter violent extremism in Somalia. And two of its main pillars was providing education for youth. And engaging youth in a positive way. Because what we noticed that in schools where we implemented education alone, it was fine. The students were in school, they were engaged, they were studying. But in the schools where we combined education with civic engagement, it has proven to be very effective that the youth were trying to utilize the skills that they have gained, the skills that they have learned, and they were taking leadership role within the school. They were mobilizing their peers. They were taking leadership role within the community. For those who are outside the classroom, the out-of-school youth, they were able to engage and interact with their community leaders, ask questions, organize a platform where they express their frustration. So that sort of combination was one of the key findings of this research. The other thing that MercyCorps and SYLI wanted to study was to use the outcome and the findings of this research for future development programs, youth development programs in Somalia and similar contexts in Somalia, and use that feedback for policymakers so that they can design in a way that feeds back into the theories of change for this type of programs. With that, I am going to hand over now to my colleague Beza, who was leading the research, to talk about more the methodology of this research and what were the findings, the surprises, and what lessons we have learned. So Beza, over to you.
Great, thank you, Feysal, and hello everyone. So I will talk now about the research study, and I wanted to start off first by talking specifically about the research questions that we tried to answer through the study. What we were trying to understand was, first of all, what was the impact of increasing access to secondary education on reducing participation and support in political violence, which includes violent extremism in this context. And then secondly, what would be the added benefit of including civic engagement with formal education on participation and support in political violence. So in order to understand this, we sort of started by sketching out some theories of change or hypotheses that link formal education and civic engagement to violence outcomes. And so you'll see on this slide three theories of change that link education to violence outcomes, and two that link civic engagement and education to violence outcomes. And I'll go through these five hypotheses very quickly. So the first one related just to formal education by itself was the notion that by increasing access to education, youth would perceive their government as being more responsive and providing basic services in a satisfactory way. And that would then reduce participation and support in violence. The second was that by getting an education, youth would feel less isolated and excluded in their community because they had a positive peer network that they were surrounded by in schools, and again, this would reduce participation and support. And then the third hypothesis was that by receiving an education, youth would feel more optimistic about their future employment opportunities, and that would reduce their level of support and participation in political violence. So those were the three hypotheses for education by itself. And then for the introduction of civic engagement to formal education, there were two separate hypotheses that we tested. The first was that youth who had an education would feel like they could make, youth who had access to civic engagement opportunities would feel like they could make a difference in their communities. So this was what we referred to as a sense of empowerment. And the second one was that youth who had access to civic engagement would gain confidence in the effectiveness of nonviolent means to affect change. So this is what we refer to as a belief in nonviolence or faith in nonviolent action. And again, these two mechanisms or hypotheses would reduce participation and support in political violence. So when we did this research, we first looked at the impact of education and civic engagement on violence outcomes. And if we saw an impact, we then tried to look at what were the mechanisms that linked the interventions to those outcomes. So very, very quickly on the methodology. First of all, this was an impact evaluation, as Feysal mentioned. It was a quasi-experimental matched impact evaluation, which means we didn't do a randomized control trial, unfortunately, because it was not feasible in this context, but we did what was considered to be the second most rigorous and scientific way of approaching this topic, which was using a matched design to evaluate the outcomes. In terms of the sampling, what we did was we first selected schools or communities where those schools existed based on the intervention type, whether it was education only or education and civic engagement, and also based on the location, so whether the area was rural or urban, to make sure we had representation of different types of neighborhoods or communities. And so based on this sampling approach, we ended up with a sample of schools in 3 areas, as you can see in this table, that included both rural and urban locations. And then once we had sampled or identified those locations, we then randomly selected youth who were either in school or out of school within those communities. So this table sort of summarizes our sampling approach, and in total we had 804 youth, 504 of them who were in school and 298 who were out of school, which we sampled and then surveyed. And as you can see here, this first round of data collection that we did was just in Somaliland. So it took place in Hargeisa, Sanaag, and Burao, 3 locations throughout Somaliland. But we are currently in the process of expanding this research into Puntland and South Central Somalia, which my colleague Karen will talk about towards the end of this presentation. But the results that I'm going to present right now are just relevant to Somaliland. And then finally, we used survey experiments in this study. These are survey questions that allow us to ask sensitive questions in a sort of indirect way, because we know that oftentimes when we probe people about sensitive items like support for violent extremism, we're not very likely to get truthful responses. So these survey experiments that we used are techniques that have been developed to elicit more truthful responses on sensitive topics, and I can get more into that if there are any questions. Okay, so now turning to the results. So the first thing I want to present is the effect of education by itself on violence outcomes. And here you will see the results for both the direct, so those are the normal survey questions, and then the indirect, those are the survey experiments that we used. And I've put in bold the effects that are statistically significant, so essentially those are the ones that really matter. And you'll see here that when we increased access to education for youth, support for political violence actually increased by 11%, which was not what we had expected, but actual use or participation in political violence reduced by 16%, which is what we had hoped to see. So this was, first of all, a bit counterintuitive, the fact that we saw increased support for political violence for youth who were educated or who were receiving secondary education. So what we did was then look at the mechanisms or the hypotheses that I mentioned, the 3 hypotheses related to education, and we tried to use these to better understand what was going on. So the first hypothesis, as I mentioned, was the idea that increasing access to education would improve young people's perceptions of government performance. And here we found, again, counterintuitively, that youth who were in formal secondary schools were less likely to think that the government was doing a good job when it came to providing education. There were, surprisingly, 34% less likely to think the government was doing a good job providing education. However, they were more likely to think that the government was doing a good job on things like healthcare and water and electricity, but significantly for education and security, their perception of the government's performance was actually negative, which again was a bit counterintuitive. So we then went on to the second hypothesis, which was that the second and third, which was first that increasing access to education would decrease isolation and exclusion, and the second was that education would increase optimism about future employment prospects. Here we found that education did indeed reduce isolation by something like 15%, as we had hypothesized. However, it also decreased optimism about future employment prospects, which is, again, not what we had hypothesized. So youth who were in formal education were less optimistic about finding future employment after they finished school. So to summarize what we saw for education by itself, we saw that kids who were in schools were less likely to be satisfied with the government's provision of education, which was not what we had expected. They were less likely to feel optimistic about future employment prospects, again, not as we had hypothesized, but they were also less likely to feel isolated and excluded in their communities, which was what we had hypothesized. So taking this as a whole, this can sort of shed light on why we see support for political violence increasing with education, because we see here that young people who are educated tend to have higher expectations in terms of government provision of services and also of future employment prospects. However, when those expectations are not met, we can see frustration leading to support for political violence, which was the case in Somaliland. However, because youth are still less isolated and excluded in their communities when they're in schools, this gives violence groups less of an opportunity to prey on them or recruit them. And so this can explain why participation was decreasing while support was increasing. So now moving on to the second set of findings around what happens when we combine civic engagements with education. Again, here we see that the results for support and participation in violence, and positively we see that both support and actual use or participation of political violence decreases when we introduce civic engagement to secondary formal education in Somaliland. And again, we wanted to understand this better, so we looked at the hypotheses linking civic engagement to violence outcomes. And we saw, first of all, that youth who were given access to civic engagement opportunities were more likely to believe that improving their community was their responsibility, so they had this sense of civic responsibility or sort of citizenship. They felt like they should make some impact in their communities. And then they also were more likely to believe that they could make a positive difference in their communities, so they felt more empowered than kids who are not given civic engagement opportunities. And then lastly, the second hypothesis, which was actually around young people's faith or belief in the efficacy of nonviolent actions. We see here that youth who were in the civic engagement activities were more likely to believe that they could effectively change things through nonviolence, through activities such as discussing concerns with a community leader or raising issues in a group or raising a complaint to a local official. And not only that, but they're also more likely to have employed those types of nonviolent activities within their communities. So again, this is a positive finding. And to summarize for the civic engagement findings, again, we saw that both participation and support for political violence dropped when civic engagement was introduced. And this was the case because youth were more likely to think that they could make a positive difference in their communities, so they felt empowered. They were more likely to have engaged in nonviolent civic actions, and they were more likely to believe in the efficacy of nonviolence to affect a change. So just to conclude and raise some policy and broader implications, the main takeaway from this research was that the combination of secondary formal education and civic engagement proved to be more effective at reducing support and participation in political violence, including violent extremism. And this raises some broader takeaways, the first being that development programs that are targeting youth and their needs should address both the lack of skills that youth are facing, so providing access to education and vocational training is important, but they should also go beyond that and also create opportunities for young people to use those skills and make a difference in their communities. So we should sort of invest not just in the skills and trainings, but also in the opportunities to employ those skills. Secondly, this research indicates that investments in development programs can have dividends when it comes to countering violent extremism or preventing violence or reducing violence more broadly. And this is something that has proven to be effective in this case, and which could be scaled up in other contexts as well, especially countries that are conflict affected, such as Somalia. And then lastly, the last takeaway is just that this research, as Feysal mentioned, is trying to answer the question, what works to reduce violence or to reduce violent extremism? And we have some evidence from this specific context and this specific program. But of course, there's much more we need to do in order to sort of tackle that question. So our last sort of takeaway is that there needs to be more evaluations and more research testing the impact of development programs on violence outcomes, especially when that is the implicit or explicit goal of the program. So I'll stop there and then turn it over to Karen, who will talk a bit about some future research that we're planning to do.
Great. Thanks, Beza. And I'm mindful of time and wanting to ensure that we have opportunities for questions. So just real briefly, Beza mentioned in the beginning of her presentation that the Hargeisa research in Somaliland was the first phase, and now we're really excited to have funding from the U.S. Institute for Peace to work together with the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice to conduct the same sort of research in South Central and in Puntland, which, as you can see from the slide, are both areas that are more insecure and have the presence of al-Shabaab and ISIS there. So it'll be great to see, again, what works for helping to prevent the support and engagement of violence for youth. So again, similar methods. We look forward to having almost a repeat ECCN webcast in the fall, perhaps even as part of the Global Education Summit to unveil that research and engage in a further dialogue with folks on that. And again, we're hoping to really be able to determine why and how youth get engaged, how they get recruited, how they become radicalized, and what is the role of education and civic engagement in those areas in particular. They're definitely different contexts that we'll be looking at. So excited to add this to our growing body of evidence. Please visit MercyCorps' website for more resources on our research into these areas. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow, that was really interesting. I am, as we're talking more and more about SEL and people, and many people say, well, we don't really know what works. It's great to see some research started in these areas, particularly in some of the very difficult ones like Somalia. For those of you who are listening, again, if you wish to submit comments or questions, please be sure to use the chat function over on the upper right portion of your screen, and we will, and you should send that to everyone so we can see what your questions are. I'm going to start out with a couple here, and I'm wondering for MercyCorps that works in other countries also where there is violence. How generalizable do you see this, or are there any special contextual factors about Somalia that make you think, this works here, but I'm not so sure about someplace else?
That's a great question, Colette. So as I mentioned in my last slide, there's really a need to replicate and do this type of research in multiple contexts if we want to be able to generalize. Obviously, the context in Somalia is unique in some ways, and again, as Karen mentioned, this was actually done in Somaliland in the first phase, where the conflict dynamics are a bit different than South Central, although there is in some ways a threat of violent extremism there as well. So I think it's hard to say how generalizable this research is without having replicated it in other locations and seeing what the outcomes might be. But I would say that in general, some of our earlier research around what drives young people to engage in violence did sort of indicate that the motivations did have to do with unmet expectations in some regard. So, that came up prominently in this study. And it also had to do with what we refer to as injustice grievances, so feelings of lack of opportunities to participate civically and politically, we've seen in other contexts as well as being key drivers. Whether or not these types of programs are effective in other locations, however, is a different question. And for that, I think we do have to replicate these studies. I think you're on mute, Colette.
Yes, is there, and so no other country pops to mind at the moment that you think, oh, I'd really love to try it there?
I think for us, we are very, very excited about the research in South Central Somalia. Our team has been working extremely hard to roll out this program in a very, very precarious context. And it's going to be very interesting to see what the results would be like there. I think it's a very relevant context, given that the Al-Shabaab and, as Karen mentioned, more recently, the Islamic State has inserted itself in the country. So I think that would be a great opportunity to begin with. But yeah, I would love to do this type of research in other places. And we've attempted to do impact evaluations in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Liberia. So we're always pushing to do it in the most interesting and conflict-affected states as well.
Okay. I'm going to start going through some of the chat questions, and I'm going to start with one that's more general and then get into some of the more specifics. We have a question from Jessica and Go, who asks, were families and community leaders informed, consulted prior to the youth engaging in more civic community activities? And that was also a question I had about, did you discuss your findings with the community, and did they have suggestions for why there might be some of these counterintuitive findings?
I can answer part of that, and then I think Feysal would be best placed to talk about how informed families and community leaders were prior to youth engaging in civic engagement activities. But in terms of the research, I just came back from a trip to the Horn of Africa, so I was out there with some colleagues in Somaliland and Kenya primarily, and so we had opportunities to debrief the study with some local actors, mostly with donors and civil society organizations, but also in some cases, for example, we talked with sheikhs and other individuals from Somalia who were working on CVE. So nobody was really surprised by the findings, actually. So that was good, I think. You know, people sort of understand how these issues apply in the context, and so there was nothing really surprising there. But in terms of the other form of community engagement, I think Feysal has some thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Beza, and thank you for asking that question. So what we do basically, our civic engagement component, our civic engagement component is a collaborative effort. We engage the community leaders. We also engage the government officials. On the other side, we inform them. Youth mobilize they go through very rigorous training, and they start mobilize. They start coming up with an action plan. Once they come up with the action plan, they inform the school administration and the school community. The parents also attend some of the activities the youth carry out. The civic a one-day civic action event organized by student leaders at school X. So they have this banner in front of their school, and they carry out the activities. They invite community leaders within their community so that they see and they are part of the civic engagement activities these students are spearheading in that particular community. So, and for the out-of-school youth, we facilitate a platform, public debates, public forums, where youth leaders invite their leaders. A governor, an MP, a minister comes in and answers some of the concerns the youth in that particular community have. So that open platform where youth get access to their leaders and ask questions. For example, one of the critical issues affecting them is illegal migration, piracy, youth who don't have the opportunity to go to school, or youth coming from marginalized communities. They go into those communities and with their community leaders and discuss openly some of the questions that those youth are facing. And they come up with a collective approach to respond and address those critical issues affecting the community. So, for example, they come up with a specific thing that they would like to address and mobilize resources, mobilize their peers, and invite community leaders so that the whole community comes together to respond to that particular concern the youth have. And it has proven to be very effective in areas that we implemented the civic engagement component. We have noticed that, as I earlier mentioned, that youth are taking leadership role. They are solving problems among themselves in schools and outside the schools in the regional youth networks. So, yeah, basically the parents and the community leaders are engaged in the type of civic engagement activities that the students or the out-of-school youth leaders carry out. We have done this in the South Central Somalia, a bit of different context, like Beza, as Beza mentioned and Karen also mentioned. And we're trying to see if our original hypothesis still holds in that different context where Al-Shabaab's threat and illegal migration and all sorts of piracy and other types of criminal activities are widespread. So we will understand if those hypotheses still hold after the next round of research is completed.
Thank you, Beza. We've got a question coming from a different direction about your sample. Eleanor Milburn was wondering about why you decided to exclude goal number 2, out-of-school youth educational activities from your research. And yes, I also wanted to ask, as part of that, had you ever considered trying to do just the civic engagement with out-of-school youth without educational activities?
Yes, that's a great question. So there wasn't really a motivation behind that, besides the fact that we just didn't have enough resources to include it in the studies. You know, we were sort of constrained by our budget, and we had to prioritize what types of interventions or what mixture of interventions we would look at. So we ended up prioritizing the civic engagement component. But I think it would be interesting to also look at non-formal education with out-of-school youth. And if we had additional resources, we would have loved to have done that.
Great. Well, there's another different question here from Arjun, excuse me if I pronounce it wrong, Upadhyay, and asks, can you describe the type of schools included in the study? You just said it's not alternative or non-formal schools. Were they mostly state schools, or is there a mix of state and non-schools, state schools within the formal system? If mixed, did you find any difference in outcome between types of schools?
I think this would be a great question for Feysal. My understanding was that all of the schools were public secondary schools, but of course in the context of Somalia that might mean something different. So I don't know, Feysal, if you have thoughts.
Yes, the schools that we targeted with this study are all SYLI constructed or rehabilitated schools, and they are all public schools that provide formal education. Remember, goal 1 for SYLI is to provide access and to quality education. So all the schools that we targeted in this area in Somaliland were all public schools, either constructed or rehabilitated under the SYLI program. But what we did basically, we included both urban and rural areas so that we have a representation from both groups in where we implemented the program in urban cities and also in the rural areas, so that we have at least some sort of sampling from the different contexts. But just to answer your question, all the schools that were targeted were SYLI supported schools constructed under USAID funding, and all are public schools that provide formal education.
Colette, I believe you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I have an office across the street from a fire station, so I don't think you want to hear all of the sirens going on back there. I wondered a bit about, if you could talk just a bit about if there were non-state schools in Somalia, and if there was any way, if they saw these results, do you think they might be interested in taking this up on their own initiative, perhaps, and perhaps scaling this up just voluntarily?
Yes, there are limited private schools, privately owned schools that provide also formal education, but those are afforded only by the well-off people who come from rich families who can afford to pay high tuition fees, can only afford to go to those schools, and they're very limited scale. As Beza, my colleague Beza mentioned, we didn't include them in our research because of the limited resources we had for the sampling size. But in the future, it's something that we can consider looking into those private schools and the type of education they provide and using them as control groups, maybe with SYLI schools. Yeah, so there are schools who provide private education, formal education, privately owned, very expensive. But SYLI provides public education and is trying to revive the public education sector that died during the conflicts and civil war in Somalia. And their youth who don't have opportunities to go to those limited expensive schools have the opportunity to go to SYLI schools and study. Colette, I think you are on mute.
Okay, no fire engines for you. Okay, we have one last question here, I think, and then we'll need to wrap up. And that question comes from Gwen Heener. And she would like to hear a bit about your methodology for asking sensitive questions. ECCN is developing a research tool that could learn a lot from your work. So how did you structure those sensitive questions, and how did you improve them, maybe through field trials or whatever?
So we used, as I mentioned, a methodology called survey experiments. And this is a technique that's been developed in social science research over the years, especially like it's been applied a lot to asking about sensitive questions around sexual behavior and violence and so forth within the U.S. context. Gradually, it's been adapted by a few researchers, notably Jason Lyle, Kasuke Eme, and Graham Blair, I think, are the three most well-known researchers that tried to apply this in contexts like Afghanistan to ask about people's support for the Taliban and Iraq as well, around support for Al-Qaeda. So we've worked with those researchers and tried to adapt the questions to the Somalia context. And there are two specific types of survey experiments that we used in this study. The first is called a random response, which essentially it involves, it's a bit complicated to explain, but it involves a spinner where the respondent spins the spinner, and depending on where the arrow lands on the spinner, that's how the respondent should respond to the question, to the sensitive question. So, for example, if it lands on answer yes, the respondent should answer yes, regardless of what they believe. If it lands on answer no, they should answer no, regardless of what they believe. And if it really lands on answer honestly, then they answer according to their beliefs on that sensitive question. And the idea here is that because the interviewer doesn't know exactly where the spinner lands, then the respondent feels like they're concealing their true views or their true opinion on that topic. But then there's some way that we can manipulate this statistically in the data to actually figure out what was the honest answer. I don't know personally how to do that, but our statistician is able to do that. But essentially the premise of these survey experiments is introducing a way to allow the respondents to feel like they can conceal their response so that they don't have to divulge it in front of the surveyor, and that makes them feel more at ease. And the other one that we use is called a list experiment, so it's similar methodology but sort of different. And they're both I think described in the report. So if anybody's more interested, that you can find more details there.
Okay, thank you, Beza. And I think that's the end of our time today. But I want to point out that we, to the listeners of the webcast, that along with a full copy of MercyCorps' study, this webcast will be available on the ECCN website within a few days. Of course, it's also available under the name Critical Choice. If you look for MercyCorps Critical Choice, you can find it online, but it will be on this webpage soon. In addition, ECCN will be sponsoring more webcasts on SEL and peace building in the coming months, and we will publicize these to members and on our website.